C. Pillay says, I also found Marandi's interview by the host of The Wire, another Western Uncle Tom sellout, nauseating. Thanks, your show is more balanced, truthful, and not biased nor prejudiced. Well, I'm sure Professor Seyed Marandi agrees with that, although he's a gracious and diplomatic man. He probably won't want to refer to his nightmare with the Wire. But welcome back, Professor. You are always welcome here, and our audience values your analysis very gratefully. Kindly, if you will, say how you see the current situation now with regard to Iran's legal, entirely legal, right to retaliate against the attack upon it by the apartheid state in Tel Aviv.
Thank you, George. I think it's inevitable. There really is nothing else that the Iranians can do. If the Iranians don't retaliate, the Israeli regime will only become more aggressive. It is a regime that only understands force, just like we saw in 2006.
Marandi back. Now, Professor, you were just saying that it was inevitable because if it didn't happen, Israel's aggression would continue unbounded, with no fear of retaliation. Please develop that point, if you will.
Absolutely. When in April, the Israeli regime bombed the Iranian consulate in Syria, the Iranians took the case to the UN Security Council. And the Americans, the British, the French, the Germans, they all supported the Israelis. They refused to have it condemned. So effectively, they endorsed the attack on Iran's embassy. Under such circumstances, what option does Iran have except to create its own deterrent? So the Iranians struck the regime. And we already know the story. The Iranians forced the Israelis and the Americans to spend roughly $4 billion to down a lot of cheap drones. Iran gained a lot of intelligence, and Iran...
Professor Marandi, I was just making the point of how foolish now it looks of the Security Council not to have condemned the breach of the Vienna Convention, Treaty of Vienna, which protects diplomatic premises. How foolish it was not to condemn Israel's egregious breach of international law by the killing of many people that took place in the Iranian embassy. They would have had, at the very least, a better leg to stand on in trying to influence how Iran now responds to the Hania case. As it happens, they refused to condemn it and now have no leg to stand on.
Yes, and recently the Americans and the British and the French, as well as the Italians, and I think the Germans, they signed a joint statement speaking of Iranian aggression. So the Israeli regime assassinated a guest, Martyr Hanieh, in Tehran, a close friend of Iran, violating Iranian sovereignty and violating international law and insulting the honor of Iran because he was our guest. And then the Americans and the Europeans have the audacity to speak of Iranian aggression, and they express their deep concern about Iran's potential aggression against the Israeli regime. So basically what the Americans and the Europeans are saying is that the only way forward is for the Iranians to strike back. When the Americans, whether it's at the Security Council, and the Europeans at the Security Council, refuse to condemn the regime and effectively endorse it, when they issue statements instead of condemning the Israelis for assassinations and murder, whether in Tehran or in Beirut, and instead they support the regime, what option do they leave for countries like Iran? So Iran has no option but to strike the regime, and it will do so. And the same is true with Hezbollah. They have no option because this is a brutal regime that's allowed to do anything it wants. And we see what they're doing in Gaza. We see how the Americans are giving $20 more billion dollars of weapons so that they can continue to slaughter. So anyone who says that the Iranians should stand down or that the Iranians should seek a diplomatic solution is simply being naive. And what they will ultimately do is they're going to encourage, if Iran was to do such a thing, and it won't, is that it will encourage the regime to carry out a more audacious attack against Iran in future, and ultimately Iran will have to respond then. So it's best for Iran to strike now to create deterrence so that it won't happen again.
So most of our audience are pondering why the delay. Ali Muhammad says, for example, is the delay due to pilgrims going in their hundreds of thousands walking to Karbala, to Iraq? Others think it may be connected to the so-called ceasefire talks on the 15th, tomorrow. Others think there must be frantic negotiation going on behind the scenes. Others think there may be some division in Iran about the quantity, quality, nature of the Iranian response. There are many, many theories. And of course, the longer we wait, the more theories will multiply. What's your own, as an academic, what's your own analysis of why there has been this delay and whether there will be much more delay?
Well, except for the claim of divisions in Iran, which is nonsense, and I should advise your viewers that whenever Reuters says that they've spoken to unnamed Iranian sources, that means they've been speaking to themselves. And the same is true with all the other Western media, mainstream legacy media outlets. Whenever they say, but this is something that Reuters does more than most, whenever they say an unnamed Iranian source, it's just fake news. The other issues that you raise, I cannot reject any of them. I'm sure there are a host of different issues at play which will help decide the timing of the strike and the nature of the strike. But what I can say is that part of it is psychological warfare. The Iranians see that the Israelis are very worried. They see that it's affected their economy, their airports, and their lives. And I think that is a part of it. Last time round, the Iranians did the same thing. This time round, it's taken a bit longer. I also think there are probably calculations because the Americans and the Europeans and some regional countries have mobilized to help the Israeli regime, and which I think is a very interesting point that we should always remember, that this regime is completely dependent on the West for its security. The West and some regional countries will mobilize to protect it after it carries out aggression, but they won't do anything to protect the Gazans. Instead, they'll give the Israelis more ammunition, more weapons, more funding, and more political cover. But ultimately, the Iranians are going to strike. I have no doubt about that. And the strike will be substantial. And I personally think it will be more substantial than what we saw in April.
Most people think that, and most people think that it will be of a longer duration also, and maybe even will be hybrid in character. Last time it was entirely aerial, but this time, as there are more parties involved, as you said, the Lebanese Resistance Organization itself suffered an equally dastardly political murder of its second in command in Beirut. So the possibility of movement across borders on land into the Galilee, the retaking of the Golan Heights, the relatively new player of the great people of Yemen, and their capability, the capabilities of the Iraqi resistance forces. This could be not only larger, but also of a different type, of a different character. What's your thoughts on that?
I think the more the war escalates, the worse it is for the Israeli regime, because Hezbollah has enormous potential that it's not using. And the same is true with Ansarullah. And of course, Iran is stronger than all of them combined. The U.S. Navy has been defeated by the Houthis, as they call them, or the Yemeni armed forces in Ansarullah in Yemen, in the Red Sea. So how imagine the power that Iran has. But the issue is that Netanyahu needs to survive politically. So he wants to continue the war and he wants to expand the war. Now, the Americans and the Europeans talk about escalation, possible, as you've been pointing out, the possible escalation of Hezbollah or the possible escalation of Iran. But this is not escalation. This is a response to escalation. The Israelis bombed Beirut. They bombed a civilian apartment block, killing a senior military commander, but murdering innocent civilians and wounding tens of others. So Hezbollah has to respond. Otherwise, the Israelis will do it again and again. The only way to stop the Israeli regime is through force, because Western countries do not want to yank on Netanyahu back, or they don't want to pull him back from escalating. So when the Americans are unwilling to pull him back, when the Europeans are unwilling to do anything about it, then Hezbollah and Iran, they have to punish them, and so does Ansarullah. But the problem is that if when Iran strikes, and let's say the Israeli regime escalates again, then what? If they don't yank on his leash, the Americans and the Europeans, then we could have a regional war. And if that happens, and the Americans get involved ultimately, then Iran will have to strike American bases in the Persian Gulf. And not only will they have to destroy American bases in the Persian Gulf, which are very easily accessible to Iran, they will also have to destroy those city-states in the Persian Gulf that are hosting those bases, because they will be a part of the problem. They'll be seen as a part of the aggression. So if Iran destroys their oil and gas installations, which they will have to do, and if the American bases and embassy is overrun in Iraq, what will happen to the global economy? You will have, when no more oil and gas leaves this region, then what the global economy will collapse. It'll be far worse than 1929 and the 1930s and during the Great Depression. So the Americans and the Europeans have to ultimately take a decision. It is Netanyahu that's escalating. It's not Iran or Hezbollah or Ansarullah or anyone else. These are the entities that are responding to prevent further escalation, because they know that if they don't respond, the Israelis will take it further and further and further.
We'll leave it there, because that was such a powerful answer. It would be impossible to top it. Professor Marandi, thank you, as always, for joining us on the mother of all talk shows.